you've heard the term exercise is medicine, right? So if you exercise and you're healthier, you also reduce your risk of having some sort of cardiac event or a heat-related event during a heat wave, right? Elderly people who have chronic disease are unhealthy and so forth are the ones that are most at risk to experiencing heat stroke or a heat illness during a heat wave. But even if they just exercise and they're healthier and some of those chronic conditions are alleviated, well, then that reduces the risk as well. So it may improve their kind of resilience to the heat per se because they're fitter and they have partial acclimation, but just the fact that they're healthier might help them through the heat wave as well, because VO2 max is probably the greatest predictor for longevity, right? So the fitter you are, kind of has kind of more bang for your buck. You're better able to tolerate the heat, but you're also healthier.
Welcome to the Degrees of Health podcast, where we delve into the heat, the cold, and the spectrum of health in between. We had an awesome conversation with Julien Périard. Julien is the acting director at the University of Canberra's Research Institute for Sport and Exercise, where he leads the environmental physiology theme. We discussed how the human body changes and adapts to the heat, specifically during exercise, how our bodies work to cool themselves down in the heat, the effects of pre-cooling before exercise on performance, and all the different mechanisms at play and what happens to our body in the heat. The strongest will is the will that knows how to bend. This is consistent with the larger theme of how the human body adapts to the cold and the heat and what we can learn from that. I really hope you enjoy the conversation and learn as much as I did. Julien's a fascinating guy and I'm sure you'll learn loads. With that, here is our conversation with Julien Périard. Awesome. Well, look, Julien, thanks so much for doing this. Really appreciate you coming on.
My pleasure. Glad to be here. Looking forward to talking about heat stress.
Yes, love heat stress. It was a love-hate relationship thing, I guess. I used to live in Singapore and do a lot of competitive CrossFit. And I was convinced that just being out there in the heat, 100% humidity, a run out in that heat feels completely different to a run back home in the UK here. I mean,
I'm sure it does. Yes.
It really does. But I mean, you've spent a lot of time in exercising in heat as an athlete yourself and your in your journey. I mean, I'd love to understand more about your journey from sort of athlete to then working at the intersection between heat and performance.
Yeah, sure. Well, athlete. Yeah, I guess I did compete as a triathlete for Canada. Wasn't very good. I mean, I was all right, but wasn't going to the Olympics or anything. I did do World Cups and Continental Cups. So I raced in a few hot places. I raced in Hawaii and Puerto Rico. That was an interesting one. That was very hot down there. But I guess even then, as an athlete, that's actually after having done my master's on post-exercise heat stress, so forth. The heat wasn't really on my radar as an athlete. I was just kind of training and really never thought about heat acclimation and kind of mitigation strategies for heat. So it's really towards the end, actually. And then when I was thinking about PhDs, that I really kind of fell into heat and performance and thought about it even more. So it's kind of weird, actually, because I did my master's in that. And then when I was an athlete, I was just thinking, train. Afterwards is where I kind of developed my interest more so in exercising in the heat. So I'm Canadian. I don't know if you can tell by the accent, but I did my PhD in Sydney. So that's where I really got interested in understanding how fatigue develops during prolonged exercise, so aerobic exercise. And I guess the journey started there with a PhD, and then working in Qatar for a few years, and then back in Australia here in Canberra.
Love it. I think a good starting point, at least for the listener and myself, would be understanding the differences of exercising in normal temperatures versus actually what happens to your body physiologically when you're exercising in the heat. I'd love if you sort of double click on that. It'd be great.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so basically, when we exercise in the heat, all our physiological well, not all, but most of our physiological responses, at least those that are related to the exercise, are exacerbated or become worse. So because when we exercise, we get hot. So I think one of the first things we need to think about or to remember is that as humans, we're quite inefficient. So we produce lots of heat. So when we exercise, roughly about 20% of the energy that we convert goes into movement and 80% is released as heat. So we get quite hot. So in cool conditions, we can lose heat to that environment. So there's two ways we can lose heat. One is via convection. So we lose heat from the skin, basically as wind or airflow goes through our skin. And if the air temperature is lower than our skin temperature, then we can lose heat to the environment. But when it gets hot and ambient temperature is close to skin temperature, then that gradient is reduced or even reversed. So if ambient temperature is hotter than skin temperature, we can actually gain heat via convection from the environment. And the only other way we can lose heat is by the evaporation of sweat. So in cooler conditions, sweat and convection, so evaporation of sweat and convection are our two pathways for heat loss. But when it's hot, evaporation of sweat is the only way we lose heat. So those beads of sweat that form on our skin, they need to evaporate. So if they don't evaporate, we're only getting dehydrated essentially, and we're getting going to exacerbate our responses. So one of the other things as well is we increase our skin blood flow to lose heat via convection. So whether it's hot or not, we still increase our skin blood flow. So that kind of also exacerbates the cardiovascular response, because we need to send blood not only to the working muscles, but to the periphery to lose heat. So that kind of exacerbates the whole cardiovascular response, and increases our heart rate, especially at the start of exercise. And the hotter we get, essentially our heart senses that. So the sinoatrial node in the heart kind of senses blood temperature, and intrinsically it increases our heart rate a little bit. So as we get hotter, so when we think of thermal strain, we have to think not only of core temperature, but core temperature, muscle temperature, skin temperature. So our whole body temperature increases, and that exacerbates the cardiovascular response. So we have to send blood to the periphery, increases heart rate, but also as we get hot, autonomically, that increases our heart rate as well. So our cardiovascular response is exacerbated. So if you are running in 15 degrees Celsius at 13 kilometers per hour, you might have a certain heart rate, let's say 150, for example. And if you start running in the heat, same speed, you'll start off at a heart rate of 150. But as your exercise progresses and the cardiovascular strain is exacerbated due to that rise in thermal strain and whole body temperature, then you'll find that your heart rate keeps creeping up. So essentially, exercising in the heat just exacerbates all of our exacerbates our cardiovascular response. And perceptually, we feel that as well. So, the rating of perceived exertion, you might know that scale from 6 to 20 or 1 to 10. So whatever might feel as a 5 might start in cool conditions, might start as a 5 in the heat, but then as we get hotter and hotter, it kind of progresses to a 6, 7, 8, 9, and can even reach a 10 if we exercise for a very long period.
So, okay, I mean, I think anecdotally, I think anyone who's trained in the heat can understand how this is so much harder. It's almost incomparable if the heat's significant enough. Our body has mechanisms to cool itself down, right? So obviously sweating being one, as you said, your heart rate gets faster and compensates, I guess. Vasodilation maybe as well.
That's right.
What other mechanisms do that happen naturally without any sort of external intervention?
Well, that's it. That's the only two pathways we can lose heat. I mean, we can lose heat via evaporation of when we breathe. But in terms of autonomic responses, it's only, as you said, an increase in cutaneous blood flow, and we lose heat there via convection. There's 4 pathways through which we lose heat. So evaporation, convection, radiation, and conduction. So conduction is when we touch something and we transfer heat to something that's cooler than us. But when we're cycling or running, there's nothing that we're touching other than the handlebars when you're cycling. And then obviously that kind of is limited heat loss. When you're running, basically you have your feet in your shoes. So you're not losing heat via conduction because you're not touching anything. You lose very minimal heat through radiation. You can gain a bit of heat, obviously, through radiation from the sun, but convection through airflow and movement and sweating, evaporation of sweat are the 2 pathways. Those are autonomic pathways, but they're also obviously behavioral thermoregulation. So there's behaviors we can adopt, obviously, to kind of cool ourselves down. So if there's a glass of cold water and I'm running, I can pour that over my head. It'll feel cold. It won't lower my body temperature. Well, probably won't lower it at all. It might lower my skin temperature, underneath the cold drink in the water. And if it's a hot, dry day, pouring some extra water on my skin might help evaporate even more. Because if you're running in a very dry condition, you might find that you don't have many beads of sweat kind of dripping off your skin because they're evaporating, most of them. And you might even find that there's some kind of salty discharge on your jumper or your sweater because of the sodium that we lose through sweating. It just basically the water evaporates, or the beads of sweat evaporate, and the kind of sodium stays there. Whereas if you're in humid conditions, you'll find that you're very kind of wet, and then some of the drips of sweat are falling off the skin. So in the dry condition, if you pour water, it doesn't have to be sweat, it can be water, and those beads of water, if they evaporate off your skin, it's kind of like sweat. So it's artificially putting sweat on your skin, and those can cool you down as well.
I see. It's interesting. We had a sauna researcher called Joy Hussein on, who she's in Australia as well. And we spoke about the differences between a dry sauna, sort of your traditional Finnish sauna, and a hammam, like a steam. And she was saying how the steam is so much harder because the humidity stops your body from sweating. And I guess that's the similar sort of mechanism or similar approach here, right? It blocks the skin from actually sweating and releasing that heat. So
well, you're still sweating. So you're still producing those beads of sweat, but they're not evaporating. So it's the evaporation of that bead of sweat that cools the skin underneath the bead, and then that cools basically the blood vessels going underneath, and then they bring the cooler blood back to the central circulation. So it's really those beads of sweat evaporating that are important.
Okay.
And when it's humid outside, the vapor content in the air is so high that it can't absorb basically the moisture of that bead of sweat.
Okay, I see. So I guess that's sort of like what your body can do naturally, right? And you can't really edit that. But what interventions are there to help when you're in the heat exercising?
Yeah, well, there's a host of interventions, I guess, and there's different levels, and there's some that are more acute, some that are more chronic. So acutely, I guess one of the things that we've been talking about now is sweating, and sweating again can lead to dehydration. So ensuring that you're properly hydrated before exercise and try to replenish those water losses during exercise is probably up that list of one of the things that are important that you want to do, because research has shown that if you get dehydrated, the more dehydrated you get, you affect the skin blood flow response. The cutaneous vasodilation is reduced, so therefore that convective heat loss is reduced, and you might also even reduce your sweating response. So you're reducing the amount of sweat that you can produce, and therefore evaporate and cool you down. So if you really get dehydrated to a significant level, 5, 6, 7, 8% of your body mass loss, then that can compromise your autonomic thermoregulation. So being well hydrated beforehand, during, so that has led to things like hyperhydration. So that means drinking lots of fluids before competition, and you can drink those fluids with like glycerol or sodium, so some sort of agent that helps conserve water, because if you just drink lots of water, you'll just create more urine, so you'll have to go pee quite a lot before your competition. You'll have a bit of an increase maybe in body water content, but less so than when you combine that water with an osmotic agent that helps kind of retain that water. So hyperhydration is one, and then another one is kind of planning your hydration strategy during competition, which is an area of research that's quite contentious, I would say. So some people suggest that you drink to thirst. So however thirsty you are, you just drink. Others suggest that you have a plan for drinking based on the competition that you'll be doing or the event that you'll be doing. And I'm probably kind of in the middle of that. And it's more of it depends question, So if you're going to be running for half an hour or cycling for half an hour, the chances of getting massively dehydrated are pretty small, right? You're not going to lose 5% of your body mass in half an hour. So you can probably drink to thirst. But if you're doing a 3-hour marathon or a 3-hour long bike ride and it's hot, especially hot, then it's probably important to understand what your sweat rate is, how much you can replenish. Because again, you can probably replenish much more on the bike than you can on the run. Obviously running, there's more impact, a lot more kind of water sloshing around the stomach. So understanding the event that you're doing, the length, the environment that you'll be doing it, and as also the type of exercise that you'll be doing.
Okay, nice. I just want to go back quickly, just double click on something you said, which is the osmotic agent. And I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like a general principle, water follows salt in the body, right?
Yeah.
So when you were talking about like actually ensuring adequate hydration as opposed to just getting loads of water in and flushing it out, if you had an osmotic agent, which I'd love to actually double click on, like what the difference, what is that, electrolyte, or is that?
It can be an electrolyte, but it's sodium or glycerol are the ones, and potassium. But the ones that have been investigated a bit more are sodium and glycerol. So glycerol was actually on the banned list for WADA up until a few years ago, because it helped retain water. So, for urine tests and things like that, or even for blood tests with a biological passport, there was some suggestion or ideas potentially that if you use that and you retain more water, you can maybe hide something, or if you're taking some sort of supplement that's illegal. But now it's been taken off. So research has kind of gone back into glycerol to see how much it helps in terms of retaining water. So that's one. And sodium as well. So sodium obviously helps with retaining water because of the osmotic pressure. So if you increase your sodium, I guess, levels in your blood, and then you'll retain a bit more water as well.
Okay, right. So I think often people jump to these electrolyte supplements when actually a bit of table salt is just as effective, right? With sodium.
Yeah, you probably have to go with a bit of trial and error to determine what is, and there's some kind of charts out there, because you don't want to take too much salt either, or else it's not going to be good. But yeah, there's some things to work out there. The other thing as well is, you need to determine how much sodium you lose during exercise, because some people lose more than others. So that could factor into how much you take and how much fluids you take before exercise.
I'm pleased you brought that up. I used to play sort of reasonably serious rugby, and the club I was attached to had two sort of principles, which is hydration doesn't start on the day; it starts sort of 48 hours before. And then in the club, all next to the urinals, they had a hydration chart, which is just while you're having a pee, you can see how clear your pee is, and it told you if you're hydrated or not. Is that accurate? I was always like, really? I don't know if this is true. Is that a good measure, the sort of visible color of your urine, to see if you are adequately
Yes and
hydrated?
no. So if it's the first morning urine, then probably, because that urine is concentrated and you haven't peed all night and you haven't drank just before you've urinated. So that's probably not a bad indication. It's the same thing with the urine specific gravity, which is another test. You can look at the specific gravity of urine. So the kind of like the osmolytes in urine, for example. If it's the first morning void, that's probably relatively accurate. But as we were saying before, if you're trying to hyperhydrate and you drink quite a lot, so if you drink 3-4 liters in an hour, then you're going to have to urinate and you're going to pee quite a lot of water. And then you might have actually quite a clear urine, but that water might not yet have been absorbed into the body. So your plasma osmolality, I guess the concentration of fluid relative to osmols or sodium in your blood, might not, or might still show that you're still dehydrated, for example. So if it's the first thing in the morning, not too bad. But if it's in the afternoon after you've drank a lot, well, then your urine's going to be clear, but you might not necessarily be well hydrated.
Okay, so going into any form of heat, we should make sure we're adequately hydrated, have some adequate electrolytes, or I forget the word again, osmolytic?
Osmolytes, yeah. In
Osmolytes.
in your pre-hydration strategy, and then even during as well. Like if you're, if you're prone to have high concentrations of electrolytes in your sweat, then you want to kind of supplement during as well. Yeah.
Okay, nice. So it's quite interesting to understand why. I know we double clicked on it, which is, in my understanding, I'm sort of more for help with a bit of repetition, Julian. A bit slower, but it's if you aren't adequately hydrated, it affects how you can vasodilate during the heat, which then affects how your body can cool itself down.
That's right. Yeah. Well,
Okay.
so yes, that's right. So it can affect how much you can vasodilate and then lose heat via convection. It can affect how much you can sweat. So those beads of sweat, you're producing less of them. So you're also losing less heat, but it also exacerbates the cardiovascular response as well. So if you're losing a lot of sweat, then your blood volume is reduced. So therefore, so if you're exercising at a given heart rate and you have less blood volume, then that's less blood filling the heart. So because you need a certain amount of blood filling the heart to be sent to the skin, because it's vasodilated, and to be sent to the muscles that are exercising, then you'll have to increase your heart rate to maintain your cardiac output. So that's why being dehydrated also exacerbates the cardiovascular response, because the end diastolic volume is smaller, so you have to increase that heart rate.
Okay, understood. I guess this is applicable if you're exercising in the heat, or actually just you're a regular practitioner of using the sauna. I think it helps understand the sort of the everyday practitioner of just heat exposure, how you can not mess that up and go in and actually reap the benefits of it, as opposed to do yourself some harm.
Yes. Yeah.
So,
I mean, if you're going for a sauna for 15 minutes, You probably don't need to hyperhydrate and have a massive hydration strategy. You probably just drink a little bit and you'll be fine. But yeah, if you do anything much longer, then absolutely. And I mean, there's ways to actually look at your sweat rate, and actually very simple ways, because the most simple way is just body mass essentially. So ideally, you weigh yourself nude before you do your exercise, and then nude afterwards, because you can have some sweat trapped in the clothing, sometimes up to 150 grams of sweat. So that can kind of throw it off. But if you measure yourself pre and post, if you don't drink anything, the difference is basically how much you've sweated. And if you drink during there, let's say I start off, I'm at 70 kilos and I finish at 68 kilos, and I know I drank 1 liter of water. Well, essentially, you just add that. So I've lost 3 kilos, so I've sweated 3 liters essentially.
Okay, that's nice and simple,
Yeah.
which is good. What role does the heat have in performance gain? I know you mentioned it can add a greater perceived exertion rate. Is that perceived exertion rate real, and does it translate to physical benefits as to training in a normal environment?
Oh, it's definitely real. So I guess if we go to I guess the pathways or the mechanisms by which our performance is reduced or impaired in the heat, um, like we have to think this is an integrative system. The body's an integrative system, so there's not just one thing. And the decision, so there's different forms of exercise. There's constant load in the lab, anyways. There's constant load exercise to exhaustion. So I say, okay, you run or you cycle at this given speed or power output until you can't anymore. So there's nothing you can do. You can maybe change your cadence a little bit, but you'll still have the resistance will change, but the ultimate power or speed at which you'll be exercising is the same until you stop. Or I say, okay, do a self-paced exercise or a time trial. So I say, okay, finish 15 kilometers running or 40 kilometers cycling as fast as you can. And therefore you can adjust your pace during the exercise. So what happens during exercise is as we get hotter and hotter, our heart rate kind of goes up, but our VO2 max also decreases because essentially we reach maximum heart rate at a submaximal workload. So let's say I were to say exercise at 70% of your VO2 max, and that's 200 watts on the bike cycle ergometer. And I say do that in 15 degrees. After an hour, you go up initially, your core temperature goes up, then it kind of plateaus, so does your heart rate, and you kind of get to a steady state, and it's no problem. But if I say go and do that in 40 degrees and 40% relative humidity, well, the first 5-10 minutes, you probably be at the same heart rate as you are in cool conditions, but eventually you'll see your core temperature kind of keep rising. And in conjunction with that, you'll see a rise in heart rate, basically. So after 45, 60 minutes, you'll be very close to your maximum heart rate. And your core temperature will be in 39s, maybe 40 or above. So basically, you get to a point where you're basically at maximum heart rate. And if you do that, then you reach your VO2 max, but your VO2 peak, I guess, in those conditions. So it's significantly reduced. Normally, you might get to 350 watts in a normal test to get to your VO2 max. But here, because the heat's exacerbated your cardiovascular response and your heart rate's gone up, you've reached your limit, essentially, of oxygen uptake. So that's why you stop during constant load exercise. Now, during self-paced exercise, which you can alter the power output, you'll probably start off and you'll hold a certain power output in cool conditions, and you'll have a little end spurt when you know you're finishing. But in the heat, you'll probably start off similarly for 10, 15 minutes. But as you get hotter, maintaining the same power output will lead to a higher heart rate. So obviously, if you're doing a time trial and you're at 175 heart rate in cool conditions, and your maximum heart rate's 200, and in the heat, you start off at 175, which you can maintain, and then it kind of creeps up. Well, at some point you'll have to slow down, or you won't be able to keep going. So that's where that decrement in performance starts to occur in the heat. So during self-paced exercise, so you'll maintain that same heart rate, and you'll have the same RPE because the relative intensity is the same, but the absolute work rate, so the power output or the running speed, will be lower. But what happens is that in the background, your VO2 max is decreasing progressively. So the relative intensity that you're maintaining is very similar to that of cool conditions, but the absolute intensity, so the absolute wattage or speed, is decreasing. I don't know if that makes sense.
I think it does, and I mean, I'd love to sort of my understanding of it, and please shoot me down if I'm wrong, but it's in the heat, you can reach your maximal heart rate more efficiently, and as a result, you might have some training benefits off the back of that.
Okay, well that's a separate thing. So
Okay.
I wouldn't say acutely it's efficient because, you're getting tired at a lower work rate, or you're getting tired sooner. But if you go into the heat, so it comes back to your question earlier about ways to kind of improve performance in the heat. So I talked about hydration. Another one is cooling. We can talk about in a minute. But the other one, which is probably the most important one, is heat acclimation or heat acclimatization. So heat acclimation is repeated exposure to an artificial environment. So you mentioned the sauna before. That's one. Exercising in a climate chamber where you set the temperature and the humidity, or exercising outdoors and then jumping in a hot bath, for example. Those are our kind of artificial hot environments. So that's heat acclimation. And heat acclimatization is getting used to a hot environment. And we have seasonal heat acclimatization, maybe not in the UK because it doesn't get too hot,
No.
but in Australia, for example, it gets hot in the summer. So, when the summer arrives, you're not well acclimatized. By the end of summer, if you exercise, on a regular basis every week outside, you acclimatize to the heat. Or athletes sometimes, it's winter time and they're training indoors and they're going to go compete in another hemisphere where it's summer. Then they get there early and they train outside to acclimatize to the hotter environment. So I'll call it heat acclimation from now on, but if you heat acclimate, and I guess the laboratory based guidelines for that are, 10 to 14 days, ideally, 60 to 90 minutes per day, then you'll adapt to the heat. So what that means is that your resting core temperature will be a bit lower. That means the core temperature at which you'll start sweating, which is good, obviously, because you lose heat to the environment, will be a bit lower. Your sweat rate is going to be, your sweat sensitivity is going to be higher. So for a given core temperature, you'll sweat more. Your maximum sweat rate will be higher. So your ability to lose heat to the environment essentially is improved. There's improvements in blood flow as well, cutaneous blood flow, but sweating is really the primary avenue for heat loss in the heat. So that'll be improved. You might have an improvement or an expansion of plasma volume. So your total blood volume increases. So that helps obviously support your cardiovascular stability. So when you're exercising in the heat at a given workload, your heart rate will be a bit lower. Therefore, your perceived exertion will be lower. Your thermal comfort will be lower as well because your core temperature and your skin temperature is slightly lower. So you feel more comfortable in that environment. Your thirst sensation might be improved. So if you're drinking to thirst, you'll probably dehydrate less because you'll feel that thirst a bit more. So you'll be more efficient at drinking. So all of those adaptations will then help you perform in the heat. So that again is in the lab scenario. But I guess when you talk to athletes, that's where the caveats come in, because as you know, athletes have quite regimented training programs, right? So if you tell an athlete before the Olympics, go 14 days in a row for 90 minutes a day training in the heat, the coach is going to say, well, wait a minute, he's got this athlete, she or he has different things to do. So with the athletes, you kind of have to change that around a little bit. So maybe you do it a few days or a week, a month before, and then you do some top ups regularly to kind of build into the training program so it doesn't interfere with the taper and so forth. So that's how athletes are suggested to do it. So there's different ways, obviously, to do it.
It's super interesting. I mean, I'd love to go down get your thoughts on pre-cooling just before, and just make a note of that before I forget. Before we go on that, what can sort of the everyday athlete learn from those extremes of athletes getting heat acclimatized before they go off on whatever it is they've got to do? But what lessons can sort of the everyday athlete learn from those extremes of temperature?
Well, even just for the athletes that are doing triathlons in their community and so forth, just understanding how important adapting to the heat is. Unless there's unseasonably hot weather at the start of the season, where that can make the athletes more vulnerable to exertional heat illness. Because that's the other thing as well I forgot to mention, is that being heat acclimatized kind of reduces the risk of exertional heat illness, which is kind of a continuum from muscle cramps to heat exhaustion to heat injury to heat stroke, which can be deadly. So I guess for athletes, just understanding if they have a goal race, when that race will be. And most amateur races are usually in the morning, so it's not too much of an issue unless it's an Ironman. Obviously, that can be quite long. But just understanding how their body reacts to the heat and being prepared for competing in hot conditions. Now, I think one of the things that for the everyday athletes, there's lots of things that athletes can do. And I think oftentimes people try to find shortcuts to train and do things. But I would say, if you don't have your training well and right, and you're not training properly before your race, I'd say train well and do well. in your workouts rather than trying to do some heat acclimation. Do that and then supplement that and, add the heat acclimation. So don't try to find shortcuts. Having said that, heat is more and more used now as a supplement to training to kind of stimulate the training adaptation. So not necessarily all and always for adapting to the heat to compete in the heat, but just to add a training stimulus. So some athletes might do it to increase plasma volume, to increase total blood volume, which may actually help in cool conditions, which is another area that is, I'd say, maybe somewhat contentious. So, and that's whether heat acclimation helps improve performance in cool conditions. And the verdict on that is that it's certainly not detrimental. So you're not going to impair your performance in cool conditions, and you might actually improve it. So there's more and more research now showing that if you're heat acclimated, it actually can help performance in cooler conditions because
That's
of all.
Massive.
Yeah.
Do you think that literature, I mean, obviously it needs more studying, but over the next sort of 5-10 years, do you think that which way do you think that would go? Do you think it's going to prove that correct, where it does help in cooler conditions, or do you think it would just be a fringe benefit at the best?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not too sure, and it's kind of it depends. It might also depend on like the athletes or the level of athletes that's tested and on which heat acclimation is conducted. Because one of the things with heat acclimation, as you can imagine, like running a 14-day heat acclimation trial with pre and post testing, that's a month basically, right? So it's very difficult to run heat acclimation studies, and the difficult thing with there is having a control group, right? So seeing if it's a training effect or if it's actually the heat acclimation. Because if you take people and you say, oh, these university students, they fit the criteria for inclusion, and then you start training them a lot, and they don't train 10, 14 days in a row on a regular basis, and they do that, they have a bit of time to recover, then you do some post-testing. Well, there's probably a mix of heat adaptations, but also a training effect there. So you'd have to have a really good control group to identify, how much of the heat acclimation protocol you're doing is beneficial in terms of heat exposure or beneficial in terms of how much you've just trained more than you normally train. And that kind of again comes back down to who the population that's being, I guess, tested is.
Definitely. I think in my own anecdotal research, or not research, just being an idiot. And I used to swing a kettlebell in the sauna, and because there was one study, and I sort of took a bit too literally, which is if you were to exercise and then follow up in the sauna, you reap more aerobic gains than if you weren't to have a sauna after. And I thought, okay, great, I'm just going to work out in the sauna sometimes. And whether it did physiologically actually boost my fitness, or I was just working out more, whatever it was, I think mentally it was a lot harder doing those swings or burpees in a sauna than it was outside of it. So the benefit might just be your sort of mental threshold, what you can endure. And then when you go back to cooler conditions, it's hard, but it's not as hard. So again, I mean, the sort of psychological variables you can never test for may actually be quite potent, right? So
that placebo effect. But I mean, even if it's a placebo effect and it has an effect and improves your performance, well, if it improves performance, it's beneficial, I guess, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially you go to the sort of the 1%ers of elite athletes, all the edge they can get. There's this a researcher called Eric Lee, who hopefully is coming on the podcast. We've been in touch with him. He's actually moving to Canada in a bit, and he's got a lovely study where two groups, Group A and Group B, undergo an 8-week cycling program. Group A doesn't have a sauna after. Group B has a 15-20 minute sauna after. Group B, when they did the post follow-up endurance tests, on average was miles better than Group A. Is that the heat, or is it just actually sauna's a little bit of an exercise mimetic and they've just been doing more exercise? Hard to split, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess if it's the heat. If that's the effect of the heat, then I would say the heat. I mean, if it's two groups and they were the same beforehand, they did the same training program, and you added the heat, then it's the effect of the heat. Where exactly it comes from, then I hadn't seen that study. That's interesting. I'd be interested to know.
I'll ping it over. It is interesting. Yeah, that was the one I took very literally and was like, great. I need to read nothing else.
What did they assign those improvements to?
They assigned it to the combination of exercise plus heat therapy, or whatever you want to call it, heat exposure, was better than just exercise alone.
But mechanistically, they didn't measure plasma volume or hemoglobin mass, or
they might have. Those details I might have glazed over, Julian, if I'm honest. But I'll make a note of it now so I don't forget, and I'll ping it away.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to see if anything mechanistically was different.
Definitely. And then actually off the back of having Joy Hussein on, who, again, I mentioned researchers sauna and what happens to sweat during heat, is if that study was proved out true, the experiment I'd want to run is you have group A and B again, but one has a dry sauna and one has a wet sauna, a hammam, like the really humid ones, and to see which is more effective.
Yeah.
Again.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because that brings two things. One, so there is quite a host of research that's come out now from Neil Walsh's lab. He was a banger, and I think now he's at John Moore's Liverpool John Moore, sorry. And what they did is that, so they exercised in cool conditions, and then they basically went into a hot bath afterwards for 20 to 40 minutes, and that was the heat acclimation that they did. And they compared that to well, they called it a traditional heat acclimation regimen, but I'm not too sure because it was up to 60 minutes per day and only 33 degrees, which is traditionally you'd have 40 degrees and 60 to 90 minutes. So I don't think the stimulus for heat acclimation or exercise heat acclimation was as strong. But basically what they saw is that the adaptations from exercising in cool and then jumping in a hot bath were more robust than the heat acclimation regimen that they had another group or a second group of athletes do. But again, I don't think the stimulus was quite as potent. But then coming back to your question about, or your comment about dry and humid, that's for different saunas. But I have a student at the moment who's just finished and he's writing up, and he looked at a crossover design. So the same participants doing dry heat acclimation and humid heat acclimation. And we want to see if there's differences in adaptations. And he's just finished, so we haven't had a chance to look at all the data. But I'm quite
keep us posted.
Yeah. And he's actually doing another study, systematic review, which is going to be, well, I don't know how much I should say because no one's done this before, but basically we're looking at the environmental characteristics and the protocol characteristics of heat acclimation to determine how much they affect the adaptations as well. And that's, so ambient temperature, kind of humidity, duration of exposures, and the length of the protocols themselves. So that should be coming out as well. So hopefully in the next 6 months, those papers will be coming out.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we can have another discussion on that, or maybe a round two.
Sure.
It's interesting. I mean, it's in a world where people are looking for an edge everywhere, and your everyday athlete is more like the professional athlete than ever before. With a Whoop and testing their sleep and always looking for an edge. What role does pre-cooling have on, I guess, your body temperature as you exercise?
Well, like I mentioned before, as I said, as humans, we're quite inefficient. We produce lots of heat, essentially, right? So if you pre-cool your body, what you're doing is you're allowing more heat storage capacity. So you allow your body to kind of store more heat before you get to a certain core temperature. So there's different ways of cooling. So there's internal cooling and external cooling. So internal cooling is basically drinking cold water or a slushy. So it goes inside. Internal cools you down from the inside, whereas external cooling is obviously anything that's applied externally. So those are your cooling vests or ice vests, or kind of more evaporative vests that I don't think work very well, or basically going into putting cold towels or jumping in a cold bath and so forth. So there's different ways to pre-cool, and there's different levels of effectiveness as well for all those different methods. So the most effective method is jumping into a cold bath. That'll cool you down significantly, but there's a problem with that, right? And with athletes, they always warm up before exercise. So you need to warm up to get, depending on the exercise that you're doing, but you need to get your muscles up to a certain temperature to be optimally ready to kind of perform, optimally. So if you warm up and then you go into a cold bath and then you vasoconstrict and the muscle temperature goes down and core temperature goes down, then you kind of go back out and you start your exercise. Well, you might not be in an ideal physiological state from a muscle perspective to exercise. So there's a compromise there. So you want to cool down a little bit, but not too much. Ideally not, the exercising muscles too much. So jumping into a cold bath, it can't be too cold and it can't be too long either. So you have to find that kind of happy medium. And then there's, you can take an esky, for example, or a cooler, put some cold water in there with ice, take some towels, put them in there, wring them out, put them on your legs and across your shoulders, kind of cool you down. Then that cools your skin and kind of cools you down a little bit. If you do that, you kind of need to change the towels over, every 2-3 minutes because they kind of warm up. So logistically, you kind of need someone to help you to do that. And if you do that for an hour, in combination with drinking a lot of cold ice, you might be able to lower your core temperature by 0.2, 0.3 degrees, which isn't much. And that's probably the best you can do. And then if you warm up, sometimes after you warm up, you'll see that you're basically back to your normal core temperature. But having said that, if you're 0.3 degrees lower than you would be if you had normally warmed up and gotten to a higher core temperature, then you're actually starting in a bit of a better position.
So it
So
would
that's the
maybe
idea
prolong.
of pre-cooling. Sorry?
It would maybe prolong that inevitable rise in temperature that
That's right.
maybe
Yeah.
ward it
Yeah.
off a little bit further. Okay, interesting. There's another study I'll send you, which is a really fringe study out of Japan in 1991, which showed that if you pre-cool before exercise, what actually follows is luteinizing hormone, which is
Okay.
really weird. But apparently, it's just one study, right? But
Yeah.
anecdotally, actually in my blood work as well, that's been consistent. If you pre-cool before exercise, as opposed to the inverse of
Yeah.
having a cold plunge after,
Yeah. Yeah.
which actually suppresses luteinizing hormone. The inverse actually raises
Interesting.
it.
Okay.
Again, one study and just a few anecdotal bit of blood work, but
Yeah.
it's interesting how these mechanisms, they never merely do one thing, right? They affect the
That's right.
body in
That's
loads
right.
of different
Everything is
ways.
integrative. Yeah. Yeah. There's nothing ever in isolation. That's for sure.
No, not at all. So, where do you see this literature going, and like, what do you hope to learn from the heat with regards to exercise performance, and what does the next 10 years look like in the research, in
Well,
your opinion?
it's a good question. Very
And
good
actually,
question.
sorry, on that, I know you can't know things for sure, but what would you hope to find? What would you really want to know?
Well, I know some of the things that we are doing, for example. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to, I guess, tailor and understand how we can kind of tailor heat adaptations or heat acclimation to athletes. So understanding each individual athlete's response. So if you look, at reviews and papers, you get the mean, and everybody kind of goes down by, let's say, resting core temperature goes down by 0.3 degrees. But you have some people going up, some people going down much more, some people right on the mean, and so it's just understanding what are some of the factors that we might consider when we're prescribing heat acclimation to an athlete. And if they do a heat acclimation regimen 1 year, and they've trained in a specific way ahead of that, and they do that the following year, do they get the same adaptations? So just understanding at an individual level, guess what we can do with heat acclimation, because I think to a certain degree, you know, depends who you talk to, but I don't think it matters too much what you'll do. You will get adapted. And I mean, we've also suggested that, if you're going to go compete in a hot, dry environment, it's probably better to train in a hot, dry environment ahead of that. Or if it's going to be hot, humid, maybe do that because it's a bit more specific. Even if the adaptations are slightly different or not, maybe you'll get more of a, like I mentioned before, more a psychological appreciation of what that feels like, and it'll feel easier. But I mean, if you're exposed to the heat, whether it's exercising in cool conditions, jumping in a bath or a sauna, or exercising to reach a certain core temperature and stay there, or exercise and reach a certain heart rate and stay there, or exercise at home with a couple of heaters on you or extra clothing. If you get hot, you will kind of adapt. And there's different levels to that, obviously. But understanding maybe at the individual level why some people have a greater expansion of plasma volume than others, or what is required for one athlete compared to the other, is kind of what we'd like to do. And also understanding what type of heat acclimation is ideal for the athlete. Because, like I mentioned before, from an evidence-based perspective, it's 10 to 14 days, 60 to 90 minutes, 40 degrees, 40% humidity. You do that, well, okay, that's fine. You'll get adapted with that. But again, for the elite athlete, they can't just do 14 days at 90 minutes in a hot room 4 days before an Olympic event. You have to kind of tailor that. And so what that looks like, is it multiple heat acclimations during a season, and then top ups to maintain those adaptations, and then when you taper, you just do 2 or 3 in that last week and you're fine? Or do you do a bit of heat exposure and arrive to competition 2 weeks in advance so you get used to the environment there? So just kind of understanding how we can tailor that to elite athletes is probably one of the things I'd like to explore. And the other one is also, given this is, I guess, more of a public health perspective, but given climate change and ambient temperatures kind of getting higher and more frequent and severe heat waves, understanding the role of physical activity and climatization, throughout the summer, how that can help kind of build our resilience to those heat waves and kind of a warming world to a certain degree.
How do you know if you're heat adapted? I imagine it's a spectrum, and you can't really ever fully. It's not binary, but
Yeah.
how do you know?
Very good question. I mean, so if you don't test anything, like you don't test yourself, for example, it's hard to know. Like, I mean, if you spend a lot of time outside and it's hot, obviously you'll feel better, and you can look at your metrics. If let's say you have a standard running loop or cycling loop that you do, and you go out and it's roughly similar conditions at the start of summer at some point because it's a bit hotter than it should be, and then towards mid summer, and then it's similar conditions, but and you've been training similarly, you haven't changed your training patterns, but you notice your heart rate's lower and you're feeling better. Well, then obviously that's kind of a sign that you're acclimatized. So that's one of the things we're trying to do with elite athletes as well, because a lot of them do heat acclimation before going to compete in the heat. But what we're trying to encourage them to do is kind of a standardized heat response test before and after their heat acclimation regimens. So just exercise, 45 minutes, 60 minutes at a given speed or work rate. Look at your heart rate every 5-10 minutes, your RPE, measure your sweat rate pre and post. If you measure core temperature, even better. But there's different kind of physiological responses that you can measure in a standardized test, in ideally standardized environmental conditions, so that you can obviously compare, that you can objectively see if you're acclimatized or acclimated or not. Other than that, it's just going by feel, I guess.
With the we Eloise and I went to Finland in November. It was -13. It was like super cold, but we were in a sauna more than we ever had been. Off the back of that trip, considering we had a sauna every day while we were there, so it was like 5-6 days. Although the sort of average temperature when we're outside the sauna was really, really cold, would that intermittent heat exposure lead to being heat adapted when you go to sort of a slightly more hotter climate, or does it need to be regular exposure?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's such a thing as partial heat acclimation, right? So, like I mentioned before, 10 to 14 days is ideal. But, at one point, people were looking at 5 to 7 day regimens, because not everybody can do 10 to 14 days. So you do, and most of the adaptations, to be fair, 75 to 80% develop in probably the first week of heat acclimation. So you develop quite quickly, and then they kind of get optimized if you go 15, 20 days, for example. So in the first few days, you do get some pretty good adaptations. I don't know how long you were in the sauna, but if you're in there, 5 days, 5 minutes per day, probably not. But 15, 20 minutes per day, you're probably starting to adapt a little bit. Whether you'd be able to measure something physiologically that's substantial is another kind of question. But you're probably kind of starting to develop some adaptations. I mean, even regular exercise in cool conditions provides some measure of acclimation or partial acclimation, because again, when we exercise, we produce lots of heat and we're sweating. And I guess the main thing to remember is, like, to get acclimatized to the heat or acclimated to the heat, you need to increase your core temperature, and it needs to stay elevated for a while. You need to be sweating, obviously, to stimulate that, and you need to increase your skin temperature and your, I guess, skin blood flow. So if your core temperature, skin temperature are elevated and you're sweating for a certain amount of time, then you'll start inducing those adaptations to the heat.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. I mean, you speak about global warming and climate change. What strategies for people to get more acclimated? I guess the sauna would play a big role in that, or could play a big role in that.
Yeah, yeah. And
From
that's
like a public
a
health point of
very
view.
interesting question as well, because one of the things we're trying to think about is what are sustainable solutions that people can do in their home. Because I could easily tell someone, well, there's a heat wave coming next week, because usually you can kind of see when these are coming at least a few days in advance. I could say, well, go into your bath, put 40-degree water in there, and sit in there for 20 to 40 minutes for 5 days straight. Well, okay, maybe that's doable, but practically, as soon as you get the water to 40 degrees and you sit in the bath, in a few minutes, it'll start going down to 38, 37, which is your temperature. So you'll need to drain some water, heat it back up. So logistically, it gets a bit more difficult. The other thing with that as well is, if you're sitting in a hot bath for a while, a lot of the blood goes to your legs. So if you stand up too quickly, you can have orthostatic intolerance, or you can be hypotensive and kind of fall in your bathroom, hit your head. If you're by yourself, a bit dangerous. So you need to be a bit careful. So there's kind of, from a passive heating perspective, there's those solutions are kind of trying to be developed. But understanding how people I guess maybe just being more active, exercising, exposing yourself to outdoor climates, not in a heat wave, but throughout summer, kind of taking walks and being active. Maybe you get some of those partial adaptations that might help you if it's hotter.
I think it's a really interesting lens to look at exercise through. And actually, as we said, more and more people these days are taking more agency over their health and their own physical activity, and actually have ever stopped to look at their own temperature through the lens of exercise.
Yeah.
It's super interesting.
Well, even exercise is an interesting one, right? Because I mean, you've heard the term exercise is medicine, right? So if you exercise and you're healthier, you also reduce your risk of having some sort of cardiac event or a heat-related event during a heat wave, right? Elderly people who have chronic disease are unhealthy and so forth are the ones that are most at risk to experiencing heat stroke or a heat illness during a heat wave. But even if they just exercise and they're healthier and some of those chronic conditions are alleviated, well, then that reduces the risk as well. So it may improve their kind of resilience to the heat per se, because they're fitter and they have partial acclimation, but just the fact that they're healthier might help them through the heat wave as well, because VO2 max is probably the greatest predictor for longevity, right? So the fitter you are, kind of has kind of more bang for your buck. You're better able to tolerate the heat, but you're also healthier, so you need less to tolerate the heat, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
It's less of the severe stress.
I'd be super interested to hear if there's any research out there on exercising in the heat, which I've learned today would lead to greater vasodilation. And does that greater vasodilation help offset any sort of coronary heart disease or anything like this, greater than just exercising in the cold? Less from a performance point of view, more from like a preventative health longevity standpoint.
No, that's a good point. So, I mean, you vasodilate, but not much more, because when the maximum vasodilation we can get from our skin is during passive heating, right? Because there's no competition, quote unquote, for blood flow. Because when we exercise, we need to send blood to the muscles. So when we exercise, we probably only reach 50 to 60% of in terms of blood flow to the skin. We probably only reach 50 to 60% of our maximum skin blood flow, because a lot of the blood's going to the muscle. But when you're passively heating, then you can increase your blood flow to maximum. But in terms of benefits, so that's where kind of I don't know if you saw some studies coming out of Finland associated with a reduction in all-cause mortality, a reduction in dementia, in relation to how frequently people were doing saunas. And there's quite a few studies now that have come out with, so instead of heat acclimation, it's heat therapy. So sitting in a hot bath, sitting in the sauna, and helping with reducing cardiovascular disease. And partly part of the mechanism through which this occurs is through shear stress. So by being in the heat, we increase skin blood flow. It increases the stress or the shear stress in the blood vessels, and that creates it triggers, angiogenesis, so the formation of new blood vessels and so forth. So it kind of helps from that perspective through the release of nitric oxide. So there's benefits, kind of cardiovascular benefits, to being in the heat.
I didn't realize the heat can stimulate angiogenesis. I didn't know that. Just sorry, quickly for the listener as well, the vasodilation, if you think of vasoconstriction, would be a constriction of your vascular system. And Julien, please correct me if I'm wrong. And vasodilation would be to dilate, to do the opposite, to expand.
That's right. So the blood vessels, expand or contract,
Yes. And so angiogenesis would be the creation of new blood vessels. So that underlying structure would actually, I guess you're adding to the underlying structure. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then especially capillaries. So then the exchange of oxygen and CO2 in the blood and the muscles is improved.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I'm fascinated by the heat and all the sort of, Eloise and I are talking a lot about it at the moment, like what in the next 10 years, what's not going to change there's going to be more research going into the heat and a greater understanding of how it can affect our body. In a sauna where BDNF goes up and what potential cognitive impacts that has, or heat shock proteins that, make, what was it, yeast cells or mice? No, not yeast, not mice. It was, I think it was pneumatoid worms or something live longer when they're injected with heat shock proteins, which get elevated in the sauna. All these very early research, but nonetheless, directionally.
Well, even with pardon the interruption, but even with heat acclimation, your basal level of heat shock protein kind of increases, so your body's in more of a state to deal with the heat. and then the response is actually a bit dampened compared to the first acute heat stress. So there is an effect of the heat shock proteins.
Super interesting. And I mean, I think when I say we're reasonably early with all this research at the moment, and it's only going to get more and more, I guess, insightful. As you said, if you do it sensibly, the downside is not going to harm your performance, right?
That's right.
And actually, you could be positioning yourself for benefits we don't quite know about yet.
Yeah. Having said that, I would caution people doing it by themselves in their home and so forth. You need to be careful not to get too hot, especially in the home. Sometimes it's difficult, right? If you're trying to cycle and you're closing the windows and you're having a heater on, well, it's not too bad. But I'd say just watch your heart rate, and because that's one of the ways, heart rate and core temperature are quite well linked. So if you're getting to a heart rate that's too high, maybe lower your heart rate and try to maintain a given heart rate. And you might find that you have to lower your work rate to maintain a given heart rate. And then don't worry about that, because that means your core temperature is probably increased and plateauing. Another one is sometimes people put extra clothing, or sometimes they put on paint suits, right, to limit evaporation of sweat. So you can't sweat, and basically you're creating an enclosed environment or encapsulated environment. You can get quite hot. So I would caution people just to be a bit careful, not to go too crazy.
Yes, definitely. It is a stressor at the end of the day, right?
Yes.
What role does the heat have on glucose demand in the body?
So it comes back to there's a few things. So heat kind of increases the release of epinephrine, and kind of drives a bit more of that use of carbohydrate. But it's like I was saying before as well, with the change in relative intensity. So even though, if you exercise in a given work rate in the heat and in cool conditions, you'll get to a steady state heart rate, core temperature in cool conditions, and that'll increase, like I was saying before, in relation to that VO2 max decreasing in the background. So as that's decreasing in the background, relative intensity increases. So if you measure your RER, so your respiratory exchange ratio, so when you're doing a VO2 max test, you're measuring the oxygen and CO2 coming in and out, and the RER is the relationship between those two, and it goes from 0.6 to about 1 and above 1, but basically from 0.6 to 1. So 0.6 you're using fats as fuel, and 1 you're using carbohydrates or glucose and glycogen as fuel. So you'll find that your RER increases as you're exercising in the heat, with relative intensity increasing. So you are using more glucose and, like I said, glycogen as a fuel source rather than fat. So it has to do with just being hot and I guess the release of some hormones, but also the change in relative intensity.
Okay, so going into those kind of events, I guess being aware of the sort of slightly increased glucose demand might be sensible. Yeah. Okay.
Depending on how long you exercise for as well, right? Because if you're exercising for anything under an hour, then you probably don't need to pop 4 gels in that hour, for example.
Yes. You do see some people in the gyms being quite liberal with the gels for the 40-minute workout, right? But yeah, I guess the elite athletes and the Ironman and extreme endurance practitioners slightly more relevant. This has been super, super interesting, Julien. I mean, I've learned loads, and inevitably with these calls, when they're super interesting, we end them, and I have so many more questions. But one last question for you is, what surprised you most about studying the human body in the heat?
A good question. Probably how resilient the human body is, and even at how well it adapts to the heat. I've been a participant in probably most of the studies that I've done, and yeah, it's quite difficult. When you first do those sessions and you first do like the pre testing, whether it's a heat response test at a given work rate or self-paced exercise. But by the end of it, you see, as someone who's done it, you feel so much better, and seeing other people do it as well, how well it actually works. So it's probably just reinforcing. I mean, we all know how resilient the human body is, but like when you measure it and you can see it, it's quite interesting.
Sort of the ultimate human superpower, that, isn't it? It sort of distinguishes us from every other species. I mean, the ultimate adaptation machine.
Yeah.
It's super, super interesting, Julien. I really enjoyed our chat. Where can we find you? Where can we keep up with your research and all the studies you're conducting and actually being part of as well?
Yeah, well, we mentioned I was Canadian, but I'm in Canberra now. So at the University of Canberra Research Institute for Sport and Exercise, and I lead the environmental physiology theme. So you can certainly find me there. So julian.perriard at canberra.edu.au. yeah, feel free to fire off an email. Always happy to chat and discuss anything related to heat stress, as you probably noticed today.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, Julien, appreciate your time, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.